Thank you. Could you please take your seats? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Item number 26, Finance Local Property Tax Bill 2012, Committee stage, Section 1. The question is that Section 1 stand part of the bill, and on that question a division has been challenged. Tellers Tall Deputies Paul Keogh and Emmett Stagg. Tellers Neil Deputies Angus Snuddig and Ms. Catherine Murphy. Tor 84, Neil 44. Section 1 stands part of the bill. We now move on to Section 2. Could you please leave the chamber if you're not participating? Thank you. There's a time limit on this bill. Thank you. Can I call on Deputy Doherty to move amendment number 4?
I move amendment number 4. And amendment number 4 deals with some of the issues that we discussed in section 1, but goes to the crux of some of the most appalling aspects that are in this bill and areas that the government haven't legislated for in terms of how a property is valued. So amendment number 4 would actually deal with the section that looks at the chargeable value, and instead of saying that the chargeable value is the gross market value of the house, that it would actually be at the time of sale, but it would be net of the following. And I must say, to start off, Caithfirle, that this amendment was submitted to the Bills Office as 4 separate individual amendments, but without my consent has been rolled into one amendment. I did intend to have these proposed as individuals. The Minister may accept one, but maybe not the other. However, that isn't the way it has appeared on the paper. So the amendment reads that it would be the value at sale net of the following, which would be A, any outstanding liabilities on the mortgage of the relevant residential property; B, the total value of stamp duty paid following the purchase of the relevant residential property where it was brought on or after the year 2000; C, the value accruing to the relevant residential property arising from any adaptations to the property for the purpose of making it suitable for a person with a physical, sensory or intellectual disability or mental health difficulty to live in. And the 4th point is, and where the relevant residential property is in negative equity, the chargeable value shall be the current market value of the relevant property on the valuation date, less the value of the property at the time of purchase as expressed in the full value of the mortgage taken out at the time of purchase. So basically what this amendment does is it deals with the section 2 of the bill and adds in a new a new paragraph under the definitions of chargeable value. And basically, in plain English, what has been defined in this legislation is that it's the gross market value of the family home that is taxable, and that is the value that the government intends to apply to the family home tax. Of all of the elements in the bill, this definition contains one of the most unfair elements in the bill. By basing the tax on the gross market value, what you're not doing is you're refusing to take in a range of other issues that are central to the true valuation of the home. You don't take into account any outstanding mortgage. You don't take into account the issues of negative equity. You don't take into account taxes on a debt instead of taxes on an asset. And we tried to debate that earlier on, but the Minister fails to comprehend the idea that somebody would be in a house valued at €50,000 or €60,000, but has a liability of €250,000 for that same property, which is, in essence, you're taxing a debt, you're taxing a liability. The legislation also doesn't take into account the huge stamp duty paid by people who bought their homes, particularly in the height of the boom. And you don't take into account any of the adaptations that would have been made for a set of people who had to make adaptations to their house to make it suitable for people of physical, sensory, intellectual disability or mental health difficulty. So my definition is about amending the chargeable value to take these areas into account. It takes in the net value of the home. So it excludes the mortgage liability. So somebody in a €60,000 value house at this point in time, and if they had a mortgage of 250,000, and that wouldn't be, the property prices have fallen by about 55%. So if they were in a property value at 100,000, but the mortgage was 200,000, then what they have what they have is not an asset. They have a liability, and until that liability is discharged to the bank has call on that home. So if we don't take in this amendment, basically what the government are going to do is they're going to tax debts, they're going to tax liabilities for those group of people who would have mortgages in excess of, on that property, in excess of the market value of the property. The issue in terms of negative equity is also dealt with through the last section of the amendment, where the chargeable value would be the value of the house net the mortgage, the market value at the time that the mortgage was taken out. It was taken out for, and also those who have paid stamp duties have already contributed in the form of property tax, as Eamon Gilmore called it before the election, that they've paid their property tax in terms of the stamp duty, and these people shouldn't be punished again, particularly people who paid stamp duty post 2000 and paid thousands of euro in relation to stamp duty. And I recall in the 2007 general election when the property bubble had run its course and was about to crash. We had the Minister for Finance, his party, we had the Labour Party, we had Fianna Fáil as well, all scrambling to try and throw more fuel into the fire by involved in this auction politics of trying to reduce stamp duty so that people would continue to buy houses at the height of the boom. And indeed, some of the stuff that we're dealing with in this legislation is as a result of that there. Some of the concerns that we have is as a result of that there. I know a friend of mine's who moved here, moved into Dublin and bought a two-bedroom apartment, hoping that he would be able to, at a later stage, start a family and so on, have children, but bought an apartment just to get on the property ladder and paid €450,000 for it. Now, I know that family, that couple, and they can't pay their mortgage. They can't pay their mortgage. The flat that they live in, the two-bedroom apartment, is worth a fraction of that there, and they can't pay their mortgage yet. This is what has been planned, is to land them with another tax, despite the fact that they can't pay their mortgage. There is also a group of individuals who did have to adapt their houses. I know one that springs to mind, an individual, for example, who lives in an island off the coast of Donegal, and unfortunately a family member was in a serious accident, and wanting to have the family member at home, they had to expand their house, had to build onto the house a self-contained bedroom, changing room and so on, and therefore they've increased the market value of their house. This was a requirement on them to actually deal with the physical needs of that person, and there are many others as well who, through no fault of their own, or we would rather have not done it, but for one reason or another they had to adapt their house to deal with these type of issues, and again, as a result of that, they've probably increased the market value of their house. So these, Minister, in my view, are some of the most unfairest elements in this legislation. You know my opinion on the legislation. I'm completely opposed to it, and do not want to see this going through the House. But I did say at second stage that I would bring forward what I believe is sensible amendments that would actually deal with some of the worst aspects of this bill. I know that you've dismissed my comments and indeed other comments from other deputies in this House. But we'll take that with a pinch of salt, given the fact that you heap praise on your own deputy who didn't read the bill, because he made a call on you to bring forward an easy pay mechanism, which is in the bill. If he read the bill, he would know that. But he's the person he is the shining light in here, because he is calling you, Minister, bring forward an easy pay mechanism. Bring forward an easy pay mechanism. Let's not look at the section which deducts from farm payments. Let's not look at the section which deducts from the revenue. Let's not look at the section that deducts from social welfare. All of those areas have included the easy pay methods that you have. But you feel that he's the person who's the shining light in here, and we haven't given you a pittance of information or of issues that you can take with you. Minister, you promised that this legislation would be fair. The government promised that this legislation would be fair. It's the piece of legislation that the public are talking about for a long, long period of time, and your arguments about resolutions are absolute nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. You know fine well that the resolutions that go through in budget day are a separate matter, and they don't exist for eternity. They only exist until the finance bill comes in. You know that, Minister, and you're trying to play games and political nonsense there in relation to this here. This legislation doesn't have to go through tonight. It can go through in January, it can go through in February, still in enough time to give people confidence of what is in the legislation, but we're not going to get to deal with certain aspects of the bill. You say that this was fair, you promised that this would be fair, but your fairness, Minister, it must be a very different type of fairness that I believe in. And I'm conscious, I know your track record in history. In fairness, I'm a resident of a little parish in Gweedore where your view of fairness hurt people in that area many years ago when you led the party that you're now part of. But anyway, saying that, Minister, you said that this is fair, that it's progressive. It's not. But don't take my word for it, Minister. Don't take my word for it. Let's look at what the ESRI has said in relation to Budget 2013. They did a distributional impact. They've released their report, their interim report, and what they found from your budget, from Fine Gael and Labour's budget, was that those with the lowest income, the 20% with the lowest income, has taken a hit of just over 1%, and the 20% with the highest income is just over 0.5%. So twice the impact has fallen by Budget 2013 on the lowest income group instead of the highest income. That's not me, that's not Sinn Féin, that's not spin from us. There's many findings at the ESI that I don't agree with. However, that's what they've said. That's what Tim Callan, Claire Keane, Michael Savage and John Walsh, all researchers for the ESRI, have come up with in their paper. But it goes further, Minister, because they deal with the statistics then. And what they say in that paper is that property tax is a key factor in these results. For those with low incomes after housing costs, the emphasis is strongly on deferrals of property tax liability rather than income-related exemptions or relief. This means that the burden of the tax, deferred or otherwise, tend to be greatest on those in low incomes. Now, that's what the ESRI is saying in relation to that there. So I think that your impassioned plea that this is fair and the mansion tax and all the rest, it's very clear that it's not. It's very clear that it's not, and it does burden those on low incomes. The ESRI report, and I'm sure you've read it, goes further than that there and says actually what's going to happen in 2014 makes it more unfair on the lowest income burdens when the full cost of this comes into play. Minister, you said you make the appeal, or you claim that us here in the opposition, or me, and I'm sure some others, are talking in ridiculous fashion that the idea of not taxing homes is just simply ridiculous, and it doesn't have any standing. And I just wonder, have you ever sat down with Taoiseach Enda Kenny and actually told him how ridiculous he was when he made those claims? Have you told Enda Kenny how ridiculous he sounded in 1994, before people were sucked into buying mortgages, purchasing houses that are twice the cost of, the mortgage cost is twice the cost of, or the value of the property now today? Before they were paying massive stamp duty, he made these claims. And have you sat down? It's very easy for you to stand up there and say how we're all ridiculous over on this side of the House. That it's ridiculous not to talk about the notion of not taxing property. It's widening the tax base, it's fixed asset, it's good for the revenue, it'll get the country going. Have you sat down with the Taoiseach? And just to remind you, maybe if you want to sit down with him tomorrow, I want to quote what he said. He said, "It is morally unjust and unfair to tax a person's home, and by doing so, grind him into the ground. Indeed, in cases, it could be probably unconstitutional. It reminds me of a vampire tax in that it drives a stake through the heart of home ownership. Through enthusiasm and initiative, and sucks the lifeblood out of people who want to own their own home and better their position. How ridiculous was Enda Kenny to stand in this chamber and state that?
Deputy, sorry, it's a long-standing convention that we give members their titles.
Okay,
out of respect for the House and for the members of the House.
How ridiculous was Taoiseach to stand in this House and parade in here later this evening and introduce the vampire tax that is going to suck the lifeblood out of home ownership, in his words, that is going to grind people into the ground. In 1994, when he made those comments, Minister, you didn't have the issue of 170,000 people who were in mortgage distress. You didn't have hundreds of thousands of people who were in negative equity. You didn't have 87,000 people immigrating every year from our shores. You didn't have 6 successive austerity budgets that have ground people into the ground. Yet these are the comments that Taoiseach Enda Kenny had in 1994. So it's very easy and it's cheap of you, in my view, to stand there and just dismiss as rhetoric what we're saying. The idea that we want the pain that you're inflicting on ordinary people, the length and breadth of this state, to continue. Well, of course we don't. It's my families, it's my friends. I went to Australia at the end of August on my own back. Went to Australia and I met with the immigrant community the same way I did in London before and in Glasgow and in Boston before. I'm a child of parents that had to immigrate. I feel very strongly about the issue. And I can remember in Perth I spent a couple of days, and there was about 1,000. There's a group set up there, a support group set up there with over 1,000 families, not individuals, families that are in Perth. And I met quite a number of them. And a lot of them, some of them are getting on really well and some of them aren't. But all of them are quite hurt and angry because these aren't young people with no ties. They're actually families with children that they took out of school or children that will never go to school in this state. And one of the things that they kept on saying to me is that they have a property back home, they have a house back home, and they're still paying the mortgage on the house, but knowing that they'll probably never set foot in that house ever again. Some of them are lucky to have it rented out and maybe able to meet some of the mortgage costs on them. Others have simply abandoned the house at this point in time. But these families out in Perth that are trying to make a new start, that are trying to get employment out there because they can't get it here, to pay for a house that they will never set foot in, at least for many, many years to come, what you believe is not happy enough that they've emigrated, that you've provided no opportunities for them to stay here, that you have done nothing in relation to ensuring that the banks deal with debt forgiveness for those type of individuals. What you want to do is slap them with a new property tax. And it is completely immoral, in my view, and unjust. So the amendment today is supposed to be 4 different amendments, and that's the way, as I said, it's not my fault that they've come in as a combined amendment. But there are 4 key issues, in my view, that should be taken on board by the Minister. And you did say that you're not going to take any amendments tonight, but that you'll reflect on them. Now, I'm sure that it's not, it hasn't just dropped out of the sky here today, the idea that we would actually deal with the actual net value of the house. It doesn't make any sense. Like, people, you might say that you're taxing the value of the house, but if somebody has a €250,000 mortgage for a house that's only valued at 100,000, and what Deputy Stanley was talking about earlier on was the fact is that I could be sitting in a house here today on this street, paid 250,000 for it, it's now valued at 100,000. The house next door to me, exactly the same house, in the same street, in the same estate, was sold last week for 100,000. Of course that family would want to, if they could, give up their house and buy the house next door. Because what they have is a net liability of 150,000. That's what they have. It's not an asset. It's not an asset. It's a liability. If only they could do what they would like to do, is to hand back the keys to the bank and say, by the way, I'm buying the house next door for 100,000 and my mortgage is 100,000. But life isn't that simple. We know life isn't that simple. But it is unfair, completely and utterly unfair, to tax that person who now has a net debt of €150,000, who, if they can't pay that debt back to the bank will repossess the house. The bank has the first call on the house. And what you're trying to do in relation to that there is to tax debts in that circumstances. The idea that we would not take into account the huge amount of stamp duty that was paid by people in 2000. And I made my comments earlier on about the parties that rushed into the fold and started, I think it was the PDs that, rolled the ball the first time there and made the first bid in terms of auction politics. We were the only party in this House at that time to actually say not to do that there, that you were just fueling the property prices. But yet, what happened is that people didn't buy for a period of time because a new government was going to be elected, and all the major parties were agreeable that they would reduce stamp duty and encourage people to buy houses at the height of the boom, encourage people to do that, and have left them in the position that they're in. It wasn't just individual choices that people choose to buy a house at that time. There was a conspiracy, if you want to call it that, in relation to politicians who wanted to see revenue coming in from stamp duty and from transient taxes, to the developers who wanted the dream of people buying prices for 400,000 and 500,000 to never end, and for the banks who were creaming it in and getting their bonuses for giving mortgages and loans to people that they should never have given these mortgages to. And that type of troika arrangement, that love affair between key politicians, between the banks and developers, it has destroyed this economy, absolutely and utterly destroyed this economy. And you talked earlier on about GDP and the domestic economy growing and GDP growing. I can tell you, hand in heart, Minister, there will be nobody that will be more satisfied if we hit 3 or 4 or 5% of GDP growth, and in the domestic economy, if we see growth in GNP. Nobody that will be more satisfied there. But getting this country back on its feet isn't just about statistics. It is about people. And this amendment deals with people. It's not a balance sheet. We're not a set of accounts. We're people with pain, with suffering. Many people's lives didn't turn out the way that they had. Many people carry crosses for different reasons, burdens that they've had to bear for different reasons. And at this point in time, it's important that government doesn't heap that burden to them. Deputy Stanley made a point earlier on. I didn't want to reference it, but I think I should. And somebody else made it later. And I spoke to the girl in my office last week. We were doing a public meeting, and she turned around to me before the meeting. She says, "Pierce, I'm not skilled to do this." And I said, "What's wrong?" And she says, "I've had people come in to me, the same as, it was interesting just to hear other speakers say the same thing. People saying, I think I should just end it." And what Deputy Stanley said earlier on is absolutely true, and I don't think it would be unique to me. It's people, people are in dire straits, Minister. Absolute dire straits. Not everybody, but there's a section of people who are in dire straits. And when you add up the cumulative effect of what is happening out there, it's just, what they want to see is light at the end of the tunnel. The family who are tortured in their head because of this big debt that they had in their house, because they were in negative equity, as Deputy Donnelly said, they'll pay, they'll be 55 years of age before they even get to zero, before they actually start paying off their debt. They'll have paid off the negative equity portion of that. People are being tortured as a result of this here. And the idea that we would actually put a bit more pain, regardless how modest it is, and you might say it's only €4 a week or whatever it is, but to add that to them, it's simply not on. And these amendments, in my view, could be taken. I know that the government has to reach their targets. The idea of bringing €500 million in a full year on a property tax is wrong. You can't bring in that type of money if you're going to have some semblance of fairness to it. Because people in negative equity, people in mortgage distress, 177,000 families, 177,000 families in mortgage distress. That's just households, not thinking of the children. I was lucky enough to get a ticket to Croke Park for the All-Ireland final. And you see the big crowd there and the 86,000 people in Croke Park. Average families about mother and father, 2 children, 4. How many times would you fill up Croke Park with the mother, father, the children of households that are in mortgage distress? These people should not be burdened down by additional taxation. I think the 4 amendments which have been rolled into one are sensible amendments. I would ask the Minister to look at them. There are other measures that you can introduce. We've been talking about a wealth tax. You can dismiss that all you want. There are other measures that you can introduce. You can you divert the issue of pensions to 2014. There are other areas in taxation which you can tackle. Like, be very, very careful. And it's not usually I echo the sentiments of Antisha and Kenny, but it is unfair, it is unjust, and it is immoral what is being done in this legislation. But it's particularly so to target the four groups of people that I've set out to exempt or to deal with in these amendments.
Thank you, Deputy. Now I call Deputy Joe Higgins, just to say there are a number of speakers, so I'd ask deputies to be brief. Deputy Joe Higgins.
While continuing to absolutely oppose this legislation and this section, we can certainly agree with the amendment put forward by Deputy Doherty in that it would ameliorate some of the worst injustices of this property tax. And just before the detail of that, the Minister sought to satirise the deputies here on the left for opposing this tax tonight, and indeed try to Shanghai Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin to his cause of supporting this legislation that socialists and Marxists everywhere apparently are in support. Well, can I just say to the Minister in passing that Marxists and real socialists, no, I do mean real socialists, not the pseudo-social democrats that the Minister frequently meets on his trips to Europe, who do keep the name socialist in their parties, but act in perpetual prostration before the speculators and the financial marketeers and the bondholders. So it's not surprising that they would be going along with what was the wisdom of the marketplace and of the European establishment. Real Marxists and socialists, in fact, Minister, believe that you put tax and progressive taxes on surplus value, real surplus value and real profit, not on the home of the worker or the peasant, as the case might be. And a home is not a productive asset. A home, in fact, costs a lot of money to upkeep, and particularly costs for those who have mortgages, and even worse for those who are in negative equity. And in regard to this issue of the chargeable value, and the Minister tried to make a virtue out of the fact that the price of homes had fallen so dramatically since the top of the bubble. That is no consolation to those who are trapped, the tens of thousands and householders, hundreds of thousands of people trapped in the nightmare of negative equity. And it reminded me of a clash I had with the former Taoiseach, Deputy Bertie Ahern, in 2006 at the very top of the boom. And after having met a young worker and partner who had just paid $375,000 for a new modest 3-bedroom home, which was the going rate at that time, and was on a 40-year mortgage, and a banker worked out for me that on 4%, in their lifetime, they will pay €750,000 before they're clear of that mortgage. Now, it seems a long time ago, but it was only 6 years ago, which means 34 more years of that mortgage to go, which will bring these people, if they survive, which I hope they do, into their 70s. And they have that massive burden and a millstone around their neck, caused, of course, by the speculation and the profiteering, that Fine Gael never once raised its voice in opposition to during when it was going on. And you land a property tax on top of these people and call it progressive. I have to say that your concept of fairness, Minister, is really entirely upside down, as is your concept of fairness in thinking that to crucify somebody who was on the dole with this new property tax and call it fair is quite incredible. Now, the reality is that you made a conscious decision as to who you would hit, because the government and the Troika, of course, the Troika would not contemplate, being representatives as they are of the European big business and the big bankers and the financial markets, extra taxes on that sector, despite the fact that in the Eurozone at the present time, accumulated uninvested profits amount to €3 trillion. They are the taxes that are the assets and the profits that should be taxed in regard to meeting the hole that is there at the present time. And in response to myself, Minister, you on one model suggested that a 2.5% increase in corporation tax would raise 675 million. Now we have another model which would suggest massively greater amounts than that if the effective tax rate was as it should be. But there were and are alternatives, but you chose not the fair, but a grossly regressive situation. Finally, Lascian Corlia, the Minister stood up tonight and sought, by invoking the revenue, to terrify decent, ordinary taxpayers out there who, in their hundreds of thousands, opposed the household tax and boycotted it because of their understanding that it's fundamentally unjust and it's fundamentally a bondholders and a bankers bailout tax. Now, your legislation smashes the pretense of a broadening of the tax base, which I'm amazed that you tried again to justify tonight, despite the fact, in the same breath, talking about the revenue being in charge of collecting it, putting their hand into exactly the same pot of workers' incomes or social welfare in order to pay this tax. This is a pretense which you really must give up, but you sought to terrify. And you are relying on fear. It's quite clear, to try to coerce people to swallowing this injustice. Now, in a democracy, Minister, you know, it's the government that should fear the people rather than people fearing the government. But there are things, I warn you, stronger than fear. A sense of injustice and indignation is stronger than fear, which people rightly have with regard to what has been done to our society by a tiny cabal that is being legislated for week after week in this chamber to bail them out at the expense of taxpayers, of low and middle income people. And the inability to pay is stronger than fear. Now, your cynical view, Minister, that people's opposition will simply melt away like snow because you wave the revenue in front of them, may prove, I believe will prove, a very costly miscalculation for you. And the government and the revenue will rue the day that they took this course of action, because you're going into territory where this government or the revenue have never been before.
Deputy Stephen Donnelly, again on Amendment 4, Section 2. Would I ask members to try and keep their comments brief? I can't force them to do it, but there's a lot of speakers and little time.
I will ask you. Thank you, and I'd like to support the amendment. Minister, in fairness, I give you 10 out of 10 for style. It was a good reply, but probably a bit less on substance, because your reply got right to the heart of, I think, what the concern across the House is, echoed by your own backbenchers. You said that this is a tax on assets, but it's not a tax on assets. That's the whole problem with this. Let's keep using the example that Deputy Doherty used. €250,000 purchase price, €60,000 market value. What's the asset? The asset is the loan. The asset is the $250,000 that the bank owns. So if we're going to tax the asset, let's tax the bank, because they're the owner of the asset. In fact, they own the house and they own the additional amount, the extra 190,000. So If we're going to tax the asset, let's tax the bank, because they own the asset. You mentioned the Thornhill report, which you said this was based on. But of course, the Thornhill report's recommendation was not 0.18%. As you know, it was 0.1%. So nearly half of what you're bringing in. And critically, the Thornhill report recognised stamp duty. It recognised the tens of thousands of euro that have been paid by so many people, an awful lot of whom are now in negative equity, and back to the first point, don't have an asset. They don't have an asset that they're being taxed on. So I'd be delighted if you'd look at some of the other recommendations in the Thornhill report, at having the rate, at looking at stamp duty, and of course at looking at the asset. Now, you very eloquently deconstructed the name of the bill. It is a tax. It is on property. I accept that. The bit on local, I have to say I would disagree with you on, and I can use my own situation. I rent. I live in Greystones. I rent. I'm not going to have to pay it. I would pay it, actually. I, as the other deputies in here, I'm paid a very good wage for what I do. And I would pay it to Wicklow County Council because I and my family use services provided by Wicklow County Council. But I'm not going to have to pay it. That's the point. Now, I actually do own an apartment, or rather the bank owns an apartment with my name on it in Dublin. So I'm going to pay on Dublin, which I don't live in, and I'm not going to pay in Wicklow, which I do live in. And actually, I'm going to pay on negative equity in Dublin, and I'm not going to pay anything to Wicklow County Council. It goes to the very heart of the technical flaws within this legislation. I, to be honest, wouldn't have a problem paying, as a resident of Wicklow and as someone on a very decent income, I wouldn't have a problem with paying a local government tax in Wicklow. But I'm not going to have to do that. I'm going to have to pay it in Dublin on a piece of negative equity. So it really just goes to the heart of the bizarre nature of this bill. Now, you said in reply to my question, and I thank you for the reply, that the amendments will be dealt with. They won't be dealt with tonight. We know that they will be dealt with as part of the finance bill. But you mentioned the bits that would be dealt with. And you mentioned, or rather, you didn't mention negative equity. You didn't mention ability to pay. And you didn't mention regional variations, which Deputy Mitchell believes may lead to revolution in Ireland. So I just leave you with two thoughts. I imagine this is my last contribution this evening. And they are relevant to Deputy Doherty's amendment, which is this, and Deputy's already touched on it. Myself and one or two deputies here, when we were, during the previous conversation, were talking about the inability to pay and the stress of this piece of legislation. And actually, what we were talking about as well was people who were coming into the constituency offices talking about suicide, who were becoming suicidal because they were having to figure out where they were going to get the money. And of course, as was mentioned by Deputy Higgins, now they owe the money to the revenue. I mean, it's bad enough owing it to the bank, but you certainly don't want to owe it to the revenue commissioners. And as you know, the personal insolvency bill wouldn't help them because any money owed to the state or indeed to a local authority is exempt from any insolvency process. So, Minister, I'd ask you just to reflect on that over the break, when this may come back to the Finance Committee, it may come back to the House, and just say that the IMF, you have cited that the Troika is responsible for this. If you study what the IMF has done over the last number of decades, you'll see that they come in for an awful lot of criticism. They've done an awful lot of very bad things. They privatized education in parts of Africa. And people said locally that they shouldn't do it because kids would be pulled out of school. Now, the IMF said, well, look, according to our economic models, this is the right thing to do. So theoretically, this is the right thing to do. What happened in Africa in those countries is that all the kids got pulled out of school because no one had the money. No one had the money to meet the theory. Reality and practice just didn't meet. And in a crisis situation, an economic crisis situation like this one, theory, which is for steady state economies, property tax, broaden the revenue base, local services, all of that theory, it's good theory for steady state economies. But what the IMF is guilty of, time and again, all over the world, across the last number of decades, is enforcing theoretical solutions to crisis situations. And this feels to me like yet another one of those. And in 2008, ironically, the IMF was running out of money because we were in this global boom. And they came to the Kennedy School and they had a full mea culpa and said, we'll stop doing this. You know, suddenly there was no money for their kids to go to private education in DC. That sounds flippant, but that was actually the case. They were running out of money because they couldn't lend anybody any money. And that's, of course, how they pay for themselves. And they said, we won't do this anymore. We've learned from the past. But they clearly haven't. Because I don't believe you have to do this because of the Troika, but I absolutely accept that they would like to bring this in. Because in their theoretical models, that's the right thing to do. I'm finishing right now, Laskia Corla, thank you. So over the break, Minister, I would ask you to just reflect on the various points, on the inability to pay, on the stress, and on the fact that the IMF gets this wrong most of the time by applying theory to crisis, and it doesn't work. Thank you.
Come on with Deputy Catherine Murphy again, Amendment 4.
Thank you.
Section, and I'd ask you to be as brief as possible.
As possible, yeah. I'd like to support this amendment. Indeed, I have a number of amendments in myself that deal with issues like negative equity and stamp duty, and essentially, that was an area, Minister, that you yourselves talked about in your manifesto. I don't have a copy of your manifesto here, but I think it's on page 27, if I can remember rightly, because it paid a great deal of attention to what you had to say, as did a lot of people who decided to elect Fine Gael TDs to the Dáil, and they had an expectation that there wouldn't be a home tax, which I think is what you called it, and they certainly paid attention when you elaborated and said things like that you had concerns about people who were asset rich and income poor, and for the people who had paid very sizable amounts of stamp duty. You said earlier in your summing up to the first number of comments that people in bigger houses tend to have bigger incomes. Well, you didn't seem to think so in your manifesto. There were plenty of people who were asset rich and income poor, and they're going to be hit with precisely what you said you wouldn't do. It's interesting that one of the things that is often said of independents when you're contesting an election, that, oh, you know, you're not on a par with the parties because they put policies together and they put manifestos together so that people have choices. And then we see Pat Rabbit on the television telling us that's what one does. And we see something within the Fine Gael manifesto where we're being treated like some sort of a comic sketch in terms of your response for highlighting exactly what you yourselves said and what people believed. You know, it wasn't concocted before the Memorandum of Understanding, your manifesto. The Memorandum of Understanding was there before the general election. You knew what the economic situation was when you put that manifesto together. And people have an absolute right to feel enraged by that. One group of people I think we all expected would be a very high priority and we would have seen solutions rolling out at this stage are people who are in negative equity, and many of those are the ones that have distressed mortgages because they're of an age and because they bought at a particular time. And instead of offering solutions to that group of people, to be lumping on top of that additional pain and, you know, frivolously talking about it as though it's only €4 a week. Some of these people are at absolute breaking point. And the point that has been raised, and I don't want to keep on reiterating it, but about people and suicide. I had three guys in one Friday afternoon, and each of them told me that that's what they were thinking of. And it's horrific when what do you say to somebody when they're thinking of that? But there is a point, there's a breaking point for a lot of people, and there's very often two. What there is here is very often, I think you could describe as two Irelands. But one of those Irelands is doing so badly that we're, we're really putting those people at risk. I think the point in relation to the proposals for disability in this amendment are very good and worthy of consideration. Like, the irony is that you could get a grant from a local authority if you happen to live in the right county, of course, and that they have some discretionary fund so as that they can draw it down. But you could get a grant to put an extension onto your house for somebody with a disability, and then you could pay a property tax on top of a grant which you were deemed to require, so as the person could be maybe taken home out of rehab. So I think that's a really good section in that particular motion. I too have a difficulty with the issue of the word local. We don't have a local government system. We have a system of local administration, a very poor one, that is dysfunctional, and we have a very centralised system of local decision making. And the notion that we're going to suddenly change from have up to 40 councillors in a room and think that that's going to be a major reform is nonsensical. And, you know, in the absence of talking about local government reform, it's very, very difficult to talk about asking people to pay a property tax, and without making very clear exceptions where there's a where there's clear need to. I think the Commission on Taxation proposed something like a 7-year exemption for people that paid stamp duty, and I think that should be revisited, because I think it's just immoral to ask people who paid essentially a property tax to pay it again, certainly in such a tight time frame. Especially when mostly they're paying it on top of the 100% mortgages that they got. I just want to finish by talking about the revenue just for a minute. We're going to create monsters out of revenue. We're also going to lump a huge amount of responsibility onto them, or you are, Minister, and essentially there's a risk that there's a breaking point in revenue. And essentially,